Hello, everybody, and welcome to Doctor. My name is Dr. Mohamed Noor. I'm a professor at Duke University. I'm an occasional science consultant for the Star Trek universe.
And I'm Dr. Ann Marie Segal. I'm a physician. I went to Penn for undergrad and studied some biology, nowhere near as much as Dr. Mohamed Noor. And then went to medical school in Wisconsin and did some surgery residency and research in immunology, which I'm sure will come up later today.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm a lifelong Star Trek fan / fanatic.
Oh, yes. I'm with you on that. Also a lifelong Star Trek fan and fanatic. So this is an attempt to bring together two different perspectives. So I've given talks at sci-fi conventions before. I often get asked these medical questions. My answer is always like, I'm not an MD. So I reached out to my great friend, Dr. Ann Marie Segal, and said, hey, you're an MD and you know Star Trek even better than me. So why don't we talk together? I'll present the genetics perspective. You could present the medical perspective on all these questions. So we have a couple of prepared questions, and we also have some contributed ones from people out there in social media. Any thoughts before we jump in, Dr. Ann Marie?
No, just can't even wait to get started.
Same. Thank you again for doing this with me. I really appreciate it too. So we're going to go to start with by a couple of different series. Let's start with the original series. So there was an episode called the Omega Glory in this series. There's a planet that experienced a biological war involving a virus early on. A lot of the population had died and the virus was still around, but something in the environment now neutralizes the virus shortly after infection. So Captain Tracy thinks that whatever is happening on this planet also cures aging of the people there. And that's why we have people on this planet who live hundreds or maybe thousands of years. So Dr. Ann Marie, any thoughts on the episode in general or on the long life aspect?
The long life aspect was very fun. Especially the part where like Kirk and Spock are in prison and with those are the Yanks, right?
Yes.
Like the Yanks. So the Yanks demonstrate that they have like basically superior strength and they break those bars. So I kind of felt like, you know what, that's maybe one of the first clues that it's not just long life. There's something else attached to what's going on. Also, to say like they don't age, I just wanted to know, Captain Tracy hadn't been there that long, probably a couple years back. So really, like, how does he know how long is going on before they age and how long the world turned? Oh, I guess they knew about like how many rotations of whatever that thing was, 42 times, and that only happens
a
like
blackbird or something like that. Yeah.
But I just don't know like he didn't really have that big of a time frame to base it on. It was sort of just maybe word of mouth. But yeah, like there were some red flags with the strength and things like that. And everybody seemed super fit.
Well, that's Hollywood in general, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
So their explanation for it was really interesting in that they basically said it wasn't anything about the planet that would make people strong, but that as a result of this biological war, a lot of people had died. And only some people who had, extra strong immunity or immune responses were the ones who lived. So in essence, what had happened is they'd applied natural selection. They never used the word natural selection in the episode. There was just a vague comment of survival of the fittest. But that is in essence referring to natural selection. So what that is taking that segment of the population that has the highest immune response and saying those are the ones who live on. And then maybe even among that subset, maybe the ones with the highest immune response also have the most kids. So then over the course of a couple of generations, you get more and more, immune response, better antibodies, something like that. Now it's interesting because that's an accurate depiction of natural selection. So 2 thumbs up to Classic Trek for getting some science right on that. Less clear how well antibody responses to viruses would actually extend your life by, tenfold or more.
It seemed like it was interesting that Captain Tracy had really latched onto that, and then McCoy. And I don't know that I would naturally go to that. It could be anything.
Yeah.
And in that Deep Space Nine episode where the Jem'Hadar are stranded on the planet, and they're also talking about like evolving beyond needing to use the Ketracel White. They didn't necessarily. It's interesting looking as we like talk about these things. looking at 2 episodes back to back to see like how the science maybe decades before, what led them to and what it leads you to now. And it was interesting that in the Deep Space Nine episode, they don't just jump to conclusions and start bandying the word antibodies all over.
No, agreed. Well, it's interesting because a lot of aging now is thought to be associated. I mean, of course, people do die from diseases and lack of antibodies there, but a lot of aging now is thought to be associated with the shortening of telomeres, which are the end caps on all your different chromosomes. So we humans have 23 pairs of all our chromosomes, and over time, as they're replicated, you don't quite get to the very end with the replication, so you lose a little bit of the cap. And after a while, you get past the repetitive part of the cap, and you start actually losing genes that actually have important functions. So that's thought to be one of the reasons that we actually do age, and one of the reasons that's good to go ahead and renew by having this new offspring that has full-length chromosomes again. So, but the antibody thing presumably wouldn't have affected that, but it's a neat idea nonetheless.
Yeah, and sort of like a little bit of a passing of fancy in the episode, because they kind of that part gets abandoned kind of early on, and then they just talk about survival of the fittest, but there's a lot of fighting going on in fight scenes. So I think they have a little less time to talk about like the science and to wrap all of that up with them.
Oh, that's true.
But we did get to see the fantastic spear budget on
oh yes
Star Trek the original series, which also is quite impressive.
And you make a great point too, that and I always raise this with my friends who are scientists too, that they always say, oh, they didn't explain blah 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 sufficiently. Like, they're not going to give a freaking seminar on Star Trek. It's just, and
sometimes like it is science fiction. So what I really love that they do in all of these episodes that we're going to talk about is they draw on some really interesting concepts that really fuel the imagination, and then go from there. And you don't really need to have like the nitty gritty, because it's enough just to have the concept to think about it. And then if you want to take it to the next level, talk about it with your nerdy friends.
Yay, we get to do right now.
Yes.
100% agree. And the bottom line is, it is science fiction. It's okay that it's a story, but it's fun to actually capitalize on some of these things to share some true science knowledge with people, like the snippets from it, like, oh look, this is based on something real, or oh, here's how this may have worked. So maybe if they wanted to do something like that, maybe the biological weapon could be something that shrinks telomeres really fast or something. I don't know.
So interesting. so interesting.
So that maybe
it makes them wobble.
Yeah. Cool. Any other thoughts on that one? Or should we move on to the next episode?
Okay, well, I'm a 90s Star Trek.
Totally fair.
That has my heart. So let's move on, even though I do love Captain Kirk.
All right, let's talk about the next generation. So let's talk about the episode Up the Long Ladder. So there was an interesting discussion of genetic diversity. There is, on the planet Mariposa, which I think was also the name of the ship that had dropped the people off there. There were only 5 survivors on that planet originally, and deciding that was not a significant enough breeding stock, as they called it, they decided, we're going to just make clones of ourselves. So now, generations later, they see what they refer to as replicative fading. Essentially, you're making a copy of a copy of a copy, and then copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And just like if you were doing that with a book on a Xerox or regular standard paper copier, eventually you start losing words that are pieces you can't see anymore. So what they said is they need an infusion of new genetic material. That's where they want to steal these stomach epithelial stem cells. I have some thoughts, but you want to go first?
Well, I mean, just the general thoughts, which were so interesting about this episode. So first of all, so there were 2 women and 3 men in this insufficient gene pool. So I'm like, my thought would be, why not work on, have a generation or 2 of children, and then you can go to cloning when you have like more
more diversity.
Exactly. And then the other thing that was interesting was when they're trying to get more genetic material from like Riker and Pulaski, for example, which also kind of felt a little weird that they didn't get genetic material from Geordi, I guess because he's blind and they didn't want that. I'm like, he's like one of the MVPs.
Yeah, he's an MVP too. I would love somebody as smart as Geordi. Oh my gosh.
It's crazy that they did that. But so then they just start talking about like getting their DNA and doing clones and going directly from there again, which I'm like, if you have more DNA coming in, then again, you have an opportunity to sort of like mix up your genetic diversity the old fashioned way before you go right. Like they became like very addicted to cloning.
Yeah. It's a funny, I mean, that's a brilliant idea. I hadn't thought of that idea of maybe like mixing it up first, making a broader pool of yes, it's the same raw material,
just a Band-Aid a little
different
bit.
Combinations.
Yeah, and I mean, it's still probably going to be insufficient genetic material, but still like it helps you a little bit.
Totally.
Yeah, it just
Oh,
seems
totally.
like they really ran to that
Yeah.
really quick.
I love the scenes where they were getting the stomach material. It's very dramatic, like holding the syringe really
Oh
high.
my gosh, that was crazy too, because also the whole time I was watching that syringe go into the abdominal cavities, and yeah, it was super dramatic. They must have had like a minute to kill, and they were like short on material, but they were like dropping the syringe, right? Like, I guess they're like they're lying down, so hopefully like they weren't angling at all to make sure they were into the stomach.
Yeah.
Also, people's like abdominal contents can shift a little bit back and forth. Like, you do not want to be sticking a needle in somewhere where like a loop of bowel might get in the way, and then you'll perforate the bowel. It'll be a major surgery. They'll have an acute abdomen. Yeah. And like, then the cat will definitely be out of the bag that they interfered with them to get their material. But
it was neat
also,
that they, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say it was interesting that they picked specifically these stomach epithelial cells, which are thought to be stem cells. So stem cells, for anybody who isn't familiar, are ones that haven't differentiated. So like if you imagine like a one cell embryo, it obviously can become anything. You know, the cells that are descended from it can become skin or muscle or whatever. So these ones in the lining of your stomach are ones that can actually differentiate into specific other kinds of cells, into a whole variety of them. So it makes sense to grab one of those as opposed to like a skin cell, which only can produce more skin cells. So that aspect was interesting, and thumbs up to that.
And super like on trend with the pulse of 1990. I think very that was actually 1988. Or
yeah, it was right on the border. Right on the border. Yeah, I'm not sure what date.
But like to be able to kind of like insinuate mature versus immature stem cells, where like you want the least mature, the least specific, so that it can make an abundance of things later on. Yeah. Hopefully. So it was just really fascinating. Like that was all in the newspapers, especially during that time frame, and they just like beautifully and incorporated it into Star Trek, I thought.
Excellent. You're about to say something else before that? I have another thought too, but you do your other thought first, please.
Oh yeah, I was just wondering why the guy from the Planet of the Clones, when he was like on board having drinks in that in the observation deck, I think that's what they call a conference room on Enterprise D. I was just like, man, if I was him, I'd be like taking everybody's cups, trying to like take some loose hair off the back of their uniform, just like, because obviously they didn't have that many scruples.
Yeah, see, so, I think the key was the same point. It was about the stem cells. Like, I don't think they had the ability to basically make a cell become a stem cell again, which I know now we can do that a little bit better than we could back in the 1980s, 90s. But back then, you know, you get a cell, if you get a skin cell, like, well, I can make some more skin, I guess.
I thought it was really great. And I really liked the idea of like, well, they did sedate them a little bit. I mean, their eyes were open, but clearly they gave them some sort of like anxiolytic.
Yeah.
And I thought that worked well too, because like sometimes, especially for surgeries or like even smaller surgeries, when you get put to sleep, you have like benzodiazepine that sort of doesn't necessarily wipe your memory, but it makes it so that you might be a little less prone to having like a sharp short-term memories around that time period. So that worked really well in the context of the episode, where it's just because Geordi was around. And also I love that little snippet of Geordi being able to tell people are lying because he sees the reactions of lying better. So cool. And also based in the truth, like people do like speed up their heart rate a little bit. People do dilate a little bit. But maybe if you're not like trained with as a spy, you don't notice it as much. But I'm so proud of Geordi for really advancing this plot.
100% agree. Now, it was interesting to me that replicative fading aspect is a real thing. That term is something they made up, which honestly is better, I think, than the real term. The real scientific term is referred to as Muller's ratchet, mostly because this guy named Muller had elaborated. And a ratchet, you know, turns things in one direction, but then when you turn it the other way, it doesn't go back. So that's why they call it Muller's ratchet. But it's this idea of the accumulation of bad mutations in asexual or clonal populations that, you know, basically you just go generation to generation, and everybody has bad mutations or just mutations in general. So like I, for example, probably have tens or hundreds of mutations of some type relative to my parents. And it's thought that on average, at least with humans and with fruit flies, that there's on average one bad mutation, like in an evolutionary sense, not necessarily like bad, like it's immediately causing a disease, but in an evolutionary sense, something that won't persist over time. So if everybody gets one bad mutation and a whole bunch of others, it's pretty quick that you're going to get pretty bad off. And that's why it's thought that a lot of asexual species don't persist as asexual for very long, but will have some bit of exchange of genetic information in some way, shape, or form. So again, like if you imagine like two books where you're making copies and they get worse over time, if you can then pick words from this book and words from that book, you might be able to reconstitute a good book again. That's essentially what's going on with that. So that's Muller's ratchet or replicative fading, but they came up with a better term actually for it. Like, wow, I should use that in my class from now on.
It is so good. And there are a couple of terms, especially in these TNG episodes or like the very early Deep Space Nine Voyager, where I watched it when it was on. It was like end of elementary school, junior high. And for some reason, I actually think, because I heard them in Star Trek and knew they were correct from like my science classes going on, I actually thought those are real terms.
Oh, wow.
It happens again with the phage that we talk about later. But these two are definitely examples where for years, I just assumed that was like a normal term to describe some of these things.
Cool.
That's how good Star Trek is.
That's a great transition point too there. So like introduced in Next Generation, but more elaborated in Deep Space Nine, we have the Trill species. So the Trill are what they refer to as a joined species. So there's a humanoid, but the humanoid is largely serving as a host. And there's this like large slug-like thing that's housed in the belly of the Trill. And somehow it's actually controlling the behaviors. They have a shared consciousness even associated with that. I'm curious, I have some thoughts on it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts first, Dr. Ann Marie.
Well, I know like in Deep Space Nine, they elaborate occasionally in episodes as a side note about like how there's some like intervascular and also neural connections that are made in those after those first few hours of joining that then become really hard to break. And that's sort of how it's explained how like the symbiont stays alive in the person and how how their thoughts are shared and how they depend on how the host's feeling. But one really interesting thing that is differentiated between TNG and Deep Space Nine is what they call it symbiosis.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit hard to think how in the host in Next Generation, how it's really a mutual like agreement, beneficially.
Yeah.
Mutually beneficial.
Let's introduce some terms right there. So symbiosis just means two species that live in very, very close proximity. And the types of symbiosis could be mutualism, as you were just alluding to, or commensalism, where like it's kind of random, they don't really affect each other, or parasitism, which is, parasites is bad for the host. So just want to introduce those terms.
I love it. So you wonder in TNG, I know the host seems willing, especially that host that comes in at the end, but you can't help wondering, like, is it a little bit parasitic? Because this host it just seems like they're just being farmed to be a
kind of are
vessel for the space worm. Whereas like in Deep Space Nine, it seems like the hosts really get a lot out of the relationship too. It's more fulfilling. They get all this access to like memories and they really enjoy that part. And also you sort of not live forever because I don't think the symbionts can live forever, but you sort of there's a part of you left for centuries to come. So it's interesting how that symbiotic relationship seems to like change forms a little bit, and in my opinion get less problematic, and that way it's a bit more feel good to hear about hear about it, as opposed to like the TNG episode where in the end the host is just like giving its body and you're just it's
not clear what they get. Like, you're right. It's not obviously mutualistic at all. Yeah.
And they just seem so like neutral. And you kind of wonder, like, have they been genetically altered just to be a vessel? Like,
or maybe it's one of those things where the host, maybe the symbiote is giving some sort of drug that makes the host feel good about like, but it's actually not good for it.
That's interesting.
Yeah, just random thought. No, it's interesting because we actually, to some extent, we are symbionts ourselves. Because I mean, we have like a massive microbiome in our body. We like to think of ourselves as one thing, but I mean, if you got rid of all of our bacteria and associated organisms, we'd be in really, really terrible shape. And this comes up in the context of often when people take antibiotics, they have some sort of bad reaction in parts of their body, in gut or in reproductive areas or something like that. So I mean, we're kind of like that, but the more commonly talked about joined species is sort of the lichen, right, which has algal and fungal components together, and they live out there in the wild. So it's neat to see that. I was trying to think of something that had the mind link, and the only thing I call it, this isn't really a mind link. This is actually a really bad. This is definitely parasitic, but you probably remember this a couple of years ago. There was this fungus that was found that could control ants' behaviors, but essentially what it did, it severed the control of the brain from the rest of the body, and it would make the ants climb up onto these stalks of grass and then just sit there, and then the fungal fruiting body would like burst out.
Isn't like I mean, this is worse than the worst horror story.
Oh yeah, it's a lot like
even
Alien,
dream
except
that.
Alien controls you right before you die.
Oh my gosh. Like, can you imagine if they could control our bodies and we just have to sit there while they eat us?
Yeah. Oh, it's terrible.
I guess that is a little bit like Species 8472 in Voyager.
A little bit.
Oh, scary.